Hello and welcome to Everyday Medicine. I'm Dr. Luke and I'd like to thank you for joining me on this podcast series where we share conversations with colleagues exploring their special interests in medicine and bringing insights and ideas as well as advice for your medical practice. In this episode, we'll be talking with an expert who's written a wonderful book and a great guide for doctors and allied healthcare workers called The Health Practitioner's Journey. But before doing so, for Australian audiences, listening does give you eligibility for your CPD, so log in and add this as an activity. You may also consider journaling, reflection, and adding to the review and performance section in your CPD. Well, Michael Kenihan is a legend in the Australian allied health community. Over 4 decades, Michael has excelled as a sports physiotherapist, business manager, sports administrator, entrepreneur, coach, and thought leader in the health and sports medicine sectors. He's a fellow of Sports Medicine Australia and has experience running Australia's largest allied health network called Lifecare, with major acquisitions and divestitures, including an IPO. He's created several startup health businesses, including Melbourne Stem Cell Centre and technology application R-U-Ontrak. He has an amazingly positive outlook on life, is brimming with energy and vitality, and brings us along with his considerable knowledge and insights to a wonderful book he's written called The Health Practitioner's Journey, which is the subject of our podcast conversation today. The Health Practitioner's Journey is a 4-stage career plan that takes a health practitioner from graduation through to financial and personal success. Michael has written a brilliant guide which provides practical strategies along this journey designed to build one's own patient list and then to patient list ownership, leveraging of the equity created, and subsequently harnessing this potential for commercial sale. This book, in my opinion, is an essential manual for all health practitioners, including doctors, physiotherapists, and allied healthcare workers, and is bursting with details, tips, and the steps needed to gain clinical excellence and commercial success. Well, Michael spends some time in the book emphasising the need to harvest knowledge and to attain a fulfilling career, as well as how to recognise your personal potential. The Health Practitioner's Journey should be everyone's companion, an essential read before starting private practice, but also in providing a steadying guide no matter how far along the journey of your health career you are. There are plenty of insights to be found and reminded of within its pages, even for the seasoned medic or health worker. So it was a great privilege to be introduced to Michael and to have the opportunity to interview him for our podcast. Please welcome him to the conversation. Now, Michael Kenihan, welcome to Everyday Medicine. It's a real honour for me to be interviewing you about your journey through life and particularly about a book which I was privileged enough to come to the book launch of, The Health Practitioner's Journey, which is a magnificent book. And I thought it was worth, making a podcast about this and about your journey, because this is so practical for medical trainees, whether they've already sort of launched themselves into their practice or they're about to launch themselves into the practice. And of course, it's got broad reach for many other businesses, I think, not just medicine, physiotherapy, which is your background specialty. So it's a real privilege. So, Michael, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, Michael? Who are you? Where have you come from?
Sure. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me, Luke. It's a privilege to talk on your podcast. I'm very keen to do that. So, look, I'll give you a little short potted history, because I started out as a high jump. I was the state high jump champion in South Australia, and I was also a footballer, and I just kept getting injured, so much so that I wasn't able to continue competing. So that directed me into a career in physiotherapy, to be honest, because I wanted to treat sportsmen. I wanted to be in sports medicine. So I was lucky enough to get into a sports medicine centre in Adelaide. My father was a doctor, so there'd always been a medical sort of background in the family. I didn't want to be a doctor because he was an obstetrician, and my memory of him as a child growing up was that he was never home.
Never saw him.
He delivered all the babies himself. You'd know that. That era was about the doctor, the obstetrician always being there to do that. So that sort of put me off a little bit. But I got into sports medicine in a sports medicine centre with a great mentor who invited me to be involved with that clinic. I then met a guy from Victoria who suggested that what we were doing in Adelaide would be good to do in Melbourne, and invited me to be involved in a clinic that we set up with at the Melbourne Private Hospital with a surgeon called John Hart, who was a very well-known orthopod at the time.
Yeah.
And he started that centre in 1984, a long time ago, with truly multidisciplinary, with sports medicine doctors, with podiatrists, exercise physiologists even in those days, and dietitians and so on. And we then built a series of clinics, 5 sports medicine clinics over the ensuing 10 years or so. And also at the same time as building the clinics, built a partnership of 14 partners, which had become very unwieldy. So we were looking about where we would go. And in 1995, met a guy who put us on the path to what he called build to sell, which was to prepare your clinic for the eventual sale if an interested party came along. And in 2000, lo and behold, Lifecare came along and bought the business. They were from Perth. They wanted a foothold in the eastern states, so they bought our 5 practices. And that's how I really pushed into a career in management and in business, because they liked what I was doing. I was running the clinic, and they wanted me to be an executive, which I did for 2 or 3 years with their network of franchise practices. They were listed on the stock market, but they were very small. Their market cap was too small. They weren't able to survive. They eventually merged with another group, a GP group called Foundation Healthcare, and that formed IP, an independent practitioner network, which was at that point, managing director was a big, imposing SAS, ex-SAS soldier consultant who I learned so much from and survived more than thrived, because he was difficult to work with. But he was a fabulous consultant, fabulous teacher. And then I had a few years with them, and then that got to an end and I decided to resign. And then he wanted to sell the Lifecare practices out of his network. And I was approached by somebody who wanted to do that, and came back as a purchaser of the clinics that we'd actually sold into that Lifecare group. So in 2006, became an owner again of those clinics with Health Networks Australia, and worked as an executive with them, not listed then, and built that network up over the ensuing till 2017 when we sold it yet again. So that really pushed me fully into the sort of consulting sort of role that I've got now, and assisting with other businesses. So that's a very potted history, but that's how I got to where I am now.
Well, that's a big sort of a very big commercial history, isn't it? And an experience. Were you the first to set up sports medicine type clinics then in Victoria? Was that the first of its sort of style with a mix?
Yes, we were. You may remember there was a footballer called Barry Richardson who played with Richmond Football Club, and he had a clinic called Richmond Hill up on the top of the hill near the St Ignatius Church on Church Street. And he had a sports medicine facility there, but he didn't have the multidisciplines that we started with.
Yeah.
So really, in terms of the multidisciplinary approach to sports medicine, that was the first one in Victoria, and it had been very much the first one in South Australia as well. The only other sports medicine centre of note in Australia at that time was in Lewisham, up in Sydney. So yeah, that was the first multidisciplinary centre.
You've had long experience and relationship with Peter Bruckner as well. Was that where sort of Peter came into your life, your circle of influence?
Yeah, look, Peter came into my orbit in the late 80s. Oh, sorry, no, the mid 80s, because we as a group, the group I was working with, tended to be the provider of a sports medicine centre at Olympic Park. And the other tenderer was Peter Bruckner and his group.
Okay.
For whatever reason, Peter Bruckner won the tender with his group to set up that clinic in Swan Street there in Melbourne. And that's how I really became, at that time, we were probably rivals. We're both very involved with Sports Medicine Australia, but Peter was commercially the guy that led that group. They were doctor-led, whereas our group was led by me, physiotherapy-led. So there was a certain amount of rivalry, friendly rivalry. But that was good because it created that competition, which is also important. You need to have that competition to sort of help you improve what you do and to thrive, I think.
Yeah, push you out of the comfort zone a little bit. Well,
pretty much.
Thank you for that background. So, Michael, you've recently written this book, The Health Practitioner's Journey. Tell us a little bit about that. What was the motivation for your writing?
Okay. When we were doing the life care business, I mentioned the consultant from IPN, when we left that group, myself and my partner at that time, one of the partners, owners as well, John Ford, and I set up a system of mentoring for the practitioners that were in those 13, 14 clinics that we had. And we had a range of different things we would teach, from how to become more excellent clinically. We came across the idea that we needed people not just to be clinically good, but need to be commercially successful to keep them within the group. So we ran a program called Clinical Excellence Commercial Success, and matched that up with what we called relationship marketing business development. And those themes became what we then taught practitioners, younger practitioners, older practitioners, and we introduced the idea of measuring what you do, of actually setting proper planning with, goal setting, and sort of a plan that integrated both their clinical, their administration, their commercial, their sort of career path development, if you like. And we implemented this across the network quite widely. And that became something that began to attract physios to come and work with us, because the word of mouth worked very strongly then. So we actually went from putting these things on CDs, up to floppy disks, up to the technology as it improved. We set up an intranet that was a new thing at the time, and eventually it became, part of the web that we were doing. But we actually, he and I, in the sort of mid-teens of this century, we decided that we should write down what we were doing, and I started writing some of the material that we'd been teaching. And that sort of drifted on, and I didn't go anywhere with it. And then it was really after I left Life Care, and I sort of was thinking about the idea of writing a book, putting my ideas down, because I thought they would have some value. And then COVID came along, and I, like everybody else, was at home. I did a course run by a group called the Thought Leaders Business School. It was a foundation course that they ran. And part of that foundation course was how to write a book, because all the people involved with that group were developing their IP and their ideas and writing books. So with some help from them, and then from, Andy, as you know, and Chris Grierson, who also assisted, they encouraged me to work with them to write the book. So it was really the motivation I got from the mentoring we did with all these practitioners, and we saw the value of that mentoring and the worth of actually putting a structured program in place. And so the structure of the book, if you like, comes along the line of how we structured the mentoring program that we did. And that's where the 4 stages that are in the book come from, because we had the belief that to actually be successful in clinical practice, you needed to be technologically sound. You needed clinical excellence. You needed to understand the whole process of understanding clinical reasoning, manual handling, and then being able to impart to the patient a successful treatment plan, and then implement the treatment and follow the treatment up. So that was really the clinical part of the equation. And then we said, well, if people are going to stay in the business, they then need to become commercially successful. So that's where commercial mentoring of relationship marketing, developing referrers, looking at key performance indicators, increasing your planning and your outreach, that leads itself to how you then market yourself individually within the practice that you work within. So the 4 stages of the book, I based them around the notion of the list. You're a clinician, you have a list of patients. That list of patients, we talked about the first stage being about building your list by becoming clinically excellent. Then we talked about owning your list as you became commercially successful, meaning that people would follow you if you left, or would want to come and see you and become advocates for you as a clinician.
That has a lot to do with your own sort of personal reputation and relationship with the patient.
Yeah,
you have to
absolutely.
do trust and we are selling ourselves a little bit, as well as our intelligence, and giving good advice to patients, curing their issues. You also are kind of a salesman. Would you agree?
Look, I think, the word sales was a dirty word at that time, as was business success. People used to talk about me as being, but he's a business guy, or they didn't seem to like the idea that somebody would move away from the clinical side to teaching others this. But at the end of the day, in my book, I talk about the notion of the very same paradigm that's used to teach salesmen how to sell is actually very similar to the whole consultation process. You know, the old subjective, objective assessment plan can be put in a frame that's very similar to a sales training. So we talked about that. We made no apology for that because it fitted in the whole notion of developing solutions and creating a plan. Fits in with the whole sales sort of paradigm, if you like. So
I think that
became important.
Yeah, well, Michael, I think a lot of people, you know, when they develop clinical skills, they become what you're advocating, you know, but they pick it up organically almost. They don't really necessarily know. I mean, in my own case, I would say over the years, you kind of learn some of these things. You realise what works and what doesn't work and how you communicate and whatever. But we don't generally get mentoring at the base level of medical school when you're coming out, setting up a practice. So I think it's really, really important what you're saying. And I would say also to those that think it's a dirty word or whatever, it's actually providing very, very good care. It's providing very good service. And that's what you're promoting in the book.
Very good example of that was that we decided that we would set up a league table of those who generated the highest fees. And it turned out those who generated the highest fees were also considered the best clinically.
Yes.
So it was actually demonstrated to us that you could be very good clinically, but that also would mean that you could be good and successful commercially. And that was an important stage to take people through because we knew, Luke, that it was important to teach people that you could earn a decent income working within a network of practices that you didn't necessarily at that point own. So that career path then became a key part of what we were able to do with our people. And that really takes you to the third stage of the book, which is how you leverage that list of patients into your own practice, your own business that you then own, and then you bring others in to work with you. So
tell us a bit about that, because for a junior doctor or for a physiotherapist as well, it's often the case, isn't it, that they might start off in the group practice and get experience, learn their chops, if you like, feel confident. But then just tell us a bit about that third stage. They've got the clinical excellence, they've got a good relationship, they've got a list. How do they then maybe set that?
Well, we made the path for the owner of that practice in conjunction with us. They would be then treated as an owner, they would have equity, they'd have certain responsibilities, and they'd learn and they'd understand how you would go about running a business as an owner. So we were teaching them how to do that. I was talking about within the network, Luke, having practitioners that we would help or foster into ownership of practices with us as equity holders in those practices. And that was a natural extension of what they did. And when eventually I moved out of the network, that's work I started doing with people independently. And I had a number of people who come to me and say, oh, look, I've worked in practice with this person for X number of years. I've tried to get equity. I haven't got an option. And I remember one good example of a boy called Nick, who we looked at 3 or 4 potential places that he might become an equity holder in. And we actually went and spoke to owners. We looked at a greenfields opportunity. And over a year, we looked at 4 opportunities, and it became there was an opportunity that arose at one of the life care practices that he was actually working within, with the equity holder moving interstate. So I set him up to negotiate with this other guy about buying his equity. And subsequent to that, he's now with me set up another Greenfields clinic up in Healesville in the regional areas of Victoria. And we've brought practitioners from other clinics into that practice where they weren't able to get equity where they were working. So I think the opportunity of having people be nurtured into the idea of setting up their own practice is a really important one. And I've got to say the book spends a lot of time talking about either buying an existing practice or starting up a greenfields practice, because there's different pathways for those two things that need to be addressed.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Often it takes a bit of confidence, doesn't it, before you as a practitioner, ready to do that as well and make the commitment. But tell us a bit about the fourth phase, like kind of leveraging your equity and getting some commercial value out of what you've built up. Like,
Well, look, I mentioned Stephen Covey actually because I was lucky enough to attend 2 workshops with Stephen Covey as the presenter of those workshops, and that was a fabulous opportunity to learn. Anyway, Covey's habit, begin with the end in mind, is his first habit of the 7. And beginning with the end in mind is a very important tenet for people to start with. So I often say to practitioners, no matter where they are in their journey, you always need to be thinking about what your exit might be. How are you going to get out of what you're doing? It may not be till you actually decide to retire, but it could be you get fed up and a new opportunity comes, or you actually, out of the blue, someone comes and offers you, like the corporates, an opportunity to sell your practice. And then you've got to be thinking, well, what am I going to do now? So with the 4th stage, I talk about a range of different people who are not ready, people that are ready, or people that leave it too late to the point whereby their practice is all about them as an individual. And then that's a harder option for someone to sell, because when they leave the practice, some of the goodwill will also leave the practice. So I think the timing of when you look at how you might exit and move on is crucially important. And I'm teaching people now about the notion of planning for that eventuality. I'm not ready now. Well, that's fine, but we need to be thinking 5, 10 years down the track so that if the opportunity does come, you will be ready. You'll have a P&L that's easy to understand. You'll have a practice that's got a good referral base. You'll understand where the value lies in what you might ultimately sell. So I talk a lot about that in the book and take people through those various scenarios of how they're going to leave their practice, if you like, and get some equity return on what they've built over their period of owning that practice.
Michael,
business.
Do you think the notion of goodwill is as strong as it used to be? Is goodwill still like a very saleable kind of commodity?
Well, actually, good question. A very important question, because back in many years ago, practices used to have a goodwill value placed upon them. Yeah. And that was a very arbitrary number based on your telephone number and how many patients you saw and what sort of person you were and where you were located. But now the model has moved almost entirely to a multiple of your earnings, of your sustainable earnings for that practice. Now, the multiple of earnings will be dependent on a number of factors, like how much revenue you generate, what your profitability is in the practice, what the staff are like at your practice, what the premises are like. All those elements that were goodwill will contribute to what that multiple might be. So multiples in allied health practices are anywhere between 2 times sustainable earnings and 5.5 times sustainable earnings. The corporates will sometimes pay a higher number because they know that when they become in public company terms, the multiple of value for that business will be higher in a public company than in private ownership. But yeah, the notion of goodwill as a sole measure of value has been dissipated, and it really relates now to the actual multiple of earnings of the sustainable earnings that the practice will be valued at.
Well, thank you for that insight, because I've always thought that, to some degree, goodwill perhaps relied on you as a practitioner staying in the practice for a period of time, like you might sell your practice, but because often we do build a reputation based around ourselves in medicine. That has
it is an element that will also contribute. But then again, I've also seen practices where, particularly in the corporate realm, whereby what I call the unhappy vendor syndrome, where the vendor who's owned the practice is not as cooperative as they would be, and they can't let go of what they used to operate and run, and actually become a distraction or sometimes an obstacle to the changes that the new owner wants to make to the practice. So it can be a little bit of a two-edged sword, but a good, thriving mid-career practitioner, that was what was attractive to the corporates with the medical practices, to have a group of doctors who were not at the end of their career, who wanted to keep working, and the corporates came in to enhance that operation. And those practices were the more highly valued ones in the medical sphere when I worked at IPN.
Well, that's a great insight as well. Michael, if people, you're still consulting in this space, how would, no, I'll put this in the show notes, but are you available as a consultant to talk with people about selling their practices and getting the highest dollar value? How would they contact you through your website, which I'll put at the bottom? And
Yeah, the website, look, they can go to my email address, which you can show in the show, or go to the website. The information about how the consulting works is on the website, but I'm also very keen to talk to people on a one-on-one basis. So if they email me, I can then explore with them what they might be looking for, and we can see if there's a match where what they need is what I can help them with.
Yes, which direction they might want to go in. You talk a lot in the book too about about hiring staff, about how you choose staff. Well, can you make that's often a big issue, particularly in today's commercial world. Do you have any comments about that? How to hire people properly, interview them well?
I used a phrase I got out of a leadership book where they said hiring people is about getting the right people in the right role at the right time. And that sounds really easy to do. But I think you need a process for hiring people that should be around what are your recruitment strategies, which really sets you up to what it is that you want, what the right person is that you want in the business. And then I think once you've got through that stage, I think it's important to look at what the induction will be. I talk a lot about how you induct people, because I often think how someone starts within a new job is how they finish in that job. So if they start well, they'll do well. And if they end up leaving, they'll leave well. But the converse is true as well. So I think it's really about recruitment, then it's about induction, then it's about what I call teaching, training and mentoring, where you actually help the people improve their skills, initially by directing them towards what they would need specifically, and then by generally finding or helping them find the right mentors that will help them develop in the role that they're in. And I'm a big believer that everybody needs to be mentored in some way when they come into the practice. And what I find is that often it's people become discouraged when they're not getting that support from whomever the principal is. They're thrown in a room and left to them to their own devices without really knowing what they need to do. So I talk in the book about an empowered working environment, one where they've got an opportunity to contribute, to have a say to what is going on in the practice, to give their opinion, but also a place where they're going to get challenging work that will actually help them to grow, a place whereby they'll feel that they've got a value and a voice. And often, if they're treated the right way, you'll find out they've got skills you maybe didn't know they had from their CV that can then be used in the practice to either help with marketing or with managing other staff, or in fact, some of those people become good mentors to other younger people that come into the practice. So it's a very holistic approach that again needs a structure. And I think people are loath to understand the need to have structures and processes around all of these activities that we do in practice.
Yeah, I think that's extremely wise and good advice. I think often we do become busy as clinicians, and then we tend to work almost in isolation, even though we're all in the same room. We're not really all the same building. We're not really talking to each other much. And I totally agree with you. This is why everyone should be reading this book, Michael, to get the, this framework. But because seriously, we don't get that in medical school, and we don't generally get it certainly in a hospital setting. And then you're thrown out into your private practice and you're struggling, and it's overwhelming. You've got to try and find staff that you trust that can help you. You're trying to find your patient list, build the rapport, manage your family. Often you're quite young, and you often, you've got young dementia. There's lots of things you struggle with, lots of things.
Well, look, the similarities, because when I worked in the IPN network, I was responsible for Victorian medical GP practices as well. Right. Excuse me. So I actually had a lot of opportunity to spend time with GPs. They were in the corporate, some of them happy and some of them less so. But we used to talk about some of these skills, and they used to tell me exactly what you've just told me about. They didn't get the support when they became part of the corporate. They were just expected to be a doctor. And the corporates could get a lot more out of the doctors. They've got a lot more to offer than just being very good with their patient care. And unfortunately, they've not availed themselves of that expertise. And that would enhance what they did and make those much more satisfactory workplaces for everybody, really,
Yeah,
to work in.
I totally agree. I work on some medical advisory committees at bigger hospitals, and there's a bit of sort of cross fertilization. You're working in different hospitals, and you can share your opinions but and what works in one place and what could work at the place that you're an MAC on. But there's not enough of that kind of like questioning. Like, what do you think, doctor, about this process? How can we make it better? We don't do that enough, I don't think. So that it's very nice to have that in your book. You also talk. I know there's so much in your book, Michael, and people really just need to buy it to read it. We're just giving a little taster of what they might learn, and clearly we can see your expertise in this discussion. But the MKs, Michael's 19 laws of growth. Is there anything that's a standout in there? There's lots of 19 laws. There's a lot.
Oh, look, I'll give you what I think is one of the best of those laws, and I call it the hook.
Yes.
And the hook was developed from one of the physios that I work with, who used to spend a lot of time with an orthopedic surgeon watching him operate. And he used to see a lot of his foot and ankle patients. And one day he was in the surgery with the surgeon, and he had a little cuff, a canvas cuff that the surgeon used to distract the ankle joint to do his arthroscopy technique. And this guy's name's Andrew, and Andrew said to the surgeon, "Oh, look, I use those cuffs all the time to distract the ankle joint, to mobilise it in stiff ankles." So after that meeting, the surgeon, when he'd finished with the cuff, used to send the cuffs to Andrew's practice for Andrew to use. And every time the surgeon used a cuff, he thought of Andrew as the therapist he wanted to use for his rehabilitation process. So there are all sorts of hooks like that are become very important points of contact and points of linkage.
Yes.
In terms of referral. And, you as a doctor, you may even know of the physio that actually, you see at the golf club or whatever it is. It's another hook that actually reminds people that at the end of the day, referring is about relationship development.
Yes.
And that's just one of those laws. And many of them relate to how you develop relationships.
Yes, well, I agree with you. The relationship and network building is so important, and I think Stephen Covey would say you have those relationships built with integrity. They're based on it's an honest exchange of information.
Absolutely.
And wanting to actually bring a positive outcome for your patients and your clients. So it's so important. Michael, there is so much in this book, and I think people really have to read it. I suspect that there'll be a lot of people that would really benefit from seeking your advice, Michael, in terms of one-to-one, face-to-face, Zoom or whatever. They might be international, that want to talk to you about, how to build a business, how to leverage their knowledge, harvest their knowledge, sell the practice, bring other people in. There's so much information that you have that you've learned along your career, both clinically and in the business world. Can I just ask you, one of the most important bits of advice maybe you can pass on from one of your mentors? Is there something that you can sit back and say, well, that was the thing that really kind of helped me on my journey, got me thinking? Is there anything that really...
I'll take one bit of advice from a mentor who was an accountant, actually, who I met when we got involved with that sports medicine centre I mentioned in Melbourne all those years ago. And Bill's no longer with us, but Bill was a very, very smart, visionary sort of person. And he'd say to me, "Michael, you can invest in shares and you can invest in property, or you can invest in fixed interest, any of these sorts of things. But the most important investment you can make is in yourself, and to back yourself. Because if you can develop a business," that he used to use the phrase, "will make money for you while you're asleep, yet you've also got control of that business, so you can add to it, then that's really where your wealth can be generated from." And I think that piece of advice led me to the notion of practice development, building practices, buying practices, selling practices, because it created a degree of passive income that wasn't all about the technical aspect of using your hands or even you're using your brain, but you've got something that's thriving that you can have some control over, because you can't control a lot of what other investments are. So that was a really wise. I think would have only been in my mid-20s when Bill gave me that advice, and that really set us on the path to setting up other practices and involving other people to work with us, who would then build businesses that would enable us sometimes to be able to make money while we were asleep. So that was just one mentor. And the point I'll make about mentors that's really important is that the mentor's got to be the right person at the right time for you. And you'll move on from one mentor to another as you harvest knowledge, which I talk about in the book. And as you develop your skill set, you'll need a different kind of mentor. So you've got to think not just about who my mentor is, but are they the right person at that right time of my career to assist me?
Thank you for sharing that. And I really do hope that people read your book, Michael, because it is a goldmine of information and guidance, and full of wonderful stories and very good pointers. So I want to thank you again. I wish you great success with it. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us, Michael.
Been an absolute pleasure, and thanks very much for inviting me, Luke.
Pleasure. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining me on this podcast episode. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I found the conversation with Michael very inspiring and can strongly recommend this book, The Health Practitioner's Journey, which can be ordered from his website, which is noted in the show notes below. And Michael provides business coaching by appointment and mentoring, and I can guarantee he'll provide you with some insights and ideas regarding your healthcare business and practice that you just haven't considered. Well, during the podcast series, we will be covering a wide range of topics across many specialty interests. The discussions are not intended as specific medical advice for patients, but as general information only and reflect the opinions of the guests interviewed. Requests for new topics to be reviewed and comments about the conversation you've listened to are welcomed and may be emailed to manager@gihealth.com.au.